Okay, so Ramadan answer. This is Tromsø in Norway. More specifically, it's the mosque in Tromsø. Tromsø has about 1,000 Muslims, mostly Somalian refugees. And when the refugees started arriving there in the 1980s, Ramadan coincided with the midnight sun. Not this one. This midnight sun. In the summertime when the sun doesn't actually go below the horizon in the Arctic Circle. So instead, the Muslims of Tromsø followed Mecca's schedule, adjusting for time zones. So if Meccans started their fast at 5 a.m. Mecca time, Norwegians would start their fast at 5 a.m. Norway time. But it doesn't just apply to Ramadan and fasting. Muslims' daily prayers also depend on the position of the sun. So their prayer schedule is not based on the sun in Norway, but probably a place closer to the equator, maybe even Mecca. Likewise, in space, you also can't follow the position of the sun. So Muslims praying in space should face Mecca if they can find it, or Earth if they can't, and follow the schedule of wherever they took off from. Time is weird. Here on Earth, we have days, months, and years. The day is defined by the Earth rotating on its own axis just once. In solar calendars, the year is defined by the Earth's rotation around the sun, and the month is 1/12 of that. In the lunar years, a month is defined as the moon's rotation around the Earth. Kinda. And a year is 12 of those lunar months. So as a result, lunar years and solar years do not line up at all. So New Year's, for example, for Muslims and those following the Hijri calendar will be on July 29th this year. So as a result of this mismatch, Ramadan happens about 10 days earlier every solar year. This year, Ramadan is happening entirely after the spring equinox, which means that the northern hemisphere is having longer periods of daylight than the southern hemisphere. This means that people in the southern hemisphere have to fast for less time because there's less time between sunrise and sunset in the southern hemisphere. But in about 4 years' time, Ramadan will occur entirely before the spring equinox, which means people in the northern hemisphere will have shorter days and people in the southern hemisphere will have longer days. So if we're talking about who has it easier, the southern hemisphere does this year, but in about 4 years, the northern hemisphere will. Now, if you live in a tropical region or follow Mecca's schedule, this notice will be borderline indistinguishable, but the farther you go north or south, the more noticeable it will become. Even more so once you get past the Arctic Circle, where instead of having to deal with 24-hour sunlight, you'll have to deal with 24-hour darkness. I feel like the insane timescales are kind of the point. Humans have been using the sun and the moon and the stars to calculate time since forever. Our current calendar is a solar calendar. And even that doesn't line up perfectly, which is why we have leap years every 4 years, except every 100 years, except every 400 years. So if the sun changes, or the moon changes, or the Earth's orbit or rotation changes, everyone is going to be scrambling to figure out the time. But we're talking about Ramadan here. When it comes to calculating the Hijri calendar, named after the Muslim exodus from Mecca, Muslims fall onto a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is those that use Hilal. Hilal is when you go outside and physically look at the moon, assuming the conditions are clear. There are Hilal committees around the world that literally go and look for the moon. And in some places, you can submit your own moon sighting to be verified. If the Earth, Sun, or Moon, or their relative position to each other changes, these people might be out of a job, which brings us to the other end of the spectrum, those who follow a tabulated calendar. Because the movements of astronomical bodies are mostly consistent and mostly predictable, we can use mathematical models to predict calendars centuries into the future. And while modern technology makes those calendars a little bit more accurate, this practice has been going on also since forever. A lot of people think that the ancient Mayans predicted the end of the world on December 21st, 2012, but that was just the end of their calendar. They never got around to making a new one because the one that they had was accurate for centuries into the future, and carving stone is hard. All of this is to say, unless some outside force radically changes the movement of the Earth, the Sun, or the Moon, these Islamic calendars will largely remain accurate. And if some force that we're not predicting does change the movement of the Earth, the Sun, or the Moon, I don't think maintaining calendars will be our priority.